Whose nation? Aeolus. All day long on June 16, 1904, Leopold Bloom finds himself repeatedly stereotyped and essentialized by his fellow male Dubliners as a foreigner and a dirty Jew, enduring racial slurs and anti-Semitic comments, such as Ike Moses Bloom, the Sheeny, the Jew-man, that coon, a bit off the top, and so on, in spite of the fact that he too was born and raised in Ireland. In fact, Bloom is, as we have seen, as much a product of the dominant cultural discourse as they are, having also, and inevitably, absorbed the culture's Orientalist discourse and racist terminology. For example, he too is capable of participating in Jewish stereotyping, as when he praises a smart idea as an Ike touch that, calypso, or when he is willing to join the other men in the funeral carriage in joking about Reuben J. Dodd's Jewish stinginess, as he tells the story about Dodd's son being rescued from drowning. Isn't it awfully good? Bloom says. Hades. Similarly, his cultural aspirations are not that dissimilar from Buck Mulligan's Hellenist agenda, fueled as they both are by a hegemonic hierarchy and Arnoldian discourse that ranks Greek culture as the pinnacle of civilized Enlightenment high culture. Like Mulligan, Bloom affects the Greek. Metempsychosis, it's Greek. From the Greek. That means the transmigration of souls. Molly, however, sees through and shatters such hegemonic pretentiousness. Oh, rocks! Tell us in plain words. Calypso. Later, Bloom struggles with the meaning and Greek etymology of parallax. I never exactly understood. Par, it's Greek. Parallel, parallax. Metempsychosis, she called it, till I told her about the transmigration. Oh, rocks. But he is willing to concede her point about the cultural and intellectual affectation, based as it is on a privileging of Greco-Latinate polysyllabics. She's right, after all, only big words for ordinary things, on account of the sound. Lestrygonians. Joyce, of course, does, in Ulysses, Hellenize Ireland, as well as Hebraicize it, by turning it into, simultaneously, the Odyssey and the Middle East, making the racialized equation between Greek, Jew, and Irish. An episode about rhetoric, Aeolus is, in a sense, a dialogic and rhetorical discussion about nation and its corollaries, nationality and nationalism, setting up the issues that will erupt later in the Cyclops episode. Under the headline of Erin, Green Gem of the Silver Sea, the men in the newspaper office make fun of Dan Dawson's excessive rhetoric about the Irish countryside. How is that for high? Ned Lambert asks. While they may make fun of the fulsome bombast, Dawson's rhetoric is in fact not unlike the linguistic excesses of the Celtic revival which Joyce will parody in the Cyclops episode. As 'twere, in the peerless panorama of Ireland's portfolio, unmatched despite their well-praised prototypes in the vaunted prize regions, for very beauty, of bosky grove and undulating plain and luscious pasture land of vernal green, steeped in the transcendent translucent glow of our mild, mysterious Irish twilight. Simon Dedalus' sarcastic response, and Xenophon looked upon Marathon, and Marathon looked on the sea, alludes not only to the Greek Xenophon, one of the leaders of the 10,000 who looked on the sea in victory and cried, Thalata, Thalata, thus recalling Mulligan's Hellenist agenda in Telemachus, but should also invoke the concept of xenophobia, from Webster's dictionary, fear and hatred of strangers and foreigners, as the source of ethnocentric and racial prejudice, for the fear and hatred of strangers is very much an issue in this episode. When Bloom asks what it is they are all laughing about, Professor McHugh names Dawson's speech. Our lovely land. Whose land? Mr. Bloom said simply. Most pertinent question, the professor said. It is a most pertinent question indeed. For the relationship between race and nationhood is very much the subtext of the Aeolus episode, just as it will later become the overt text of the Cyclops episode. In the newspaper office, Bloom discusses a possible ad for the paper with the print foreman Joseph Patrick Nannetti, an actual Irish-Italian printer and politician who, in 1904, was the Member of Parliament for Dublin's College Green division. Bloom thinks, strange, he never saw his real country. Ireland, my country. Member for College Green. Capriani, too, printer. more Irish than the Irish. Here Bloom, who was born in Ireland, as was Nannetti, lapses into the binary trap himself, aware that his own country is Ireland in spite of the fact that the other men may see him as an untrustworthy foreigner. Bloom himself makes the same essentialist mistake here by assuming that Nannetti's real country is Italy and not Ireland. Ironically, Nannetti will that very afternoon prove how Irish he is by, as we learn in Cyclops, travelling to London so as to ask questions in Parliament about the prohibition against playing Irish games, such as hurling, in Phoenix Park, at the same time that English games such as polo were being allowed. Not only did Nannetti do just that in real life, on June 17, 1904, but both Joyce and his Irish readers in 1922 would be aware that in 1906 Nannetti would be elected Lord Mayor of Dublin, a reminder Joyce had similarly brought up in Ireland, Island of Saints and Sages, when he had likewise argued the absurdity of proclaiming any threads of racial purity within the motley fabric of Irish society. The piece Bloom is working on is the House of Keys, advertisement for Alexander Keys, tea, wine, and spirit merchant. As Bloom explains to Nannetti, the idea is the House of Keys. You know, councillor, the Manx Parliament. Innuendo of Home Rule. Tourists, you know, from the Isle of Man. The ad puns on the House of Keys, the name of the Manx Parliament, with its innuendo of Home Rule. The irony is that neither Bloom nor Nannetti nor Stephen are accorded any sovereignty in their own homes or nation. Both Bloom and Stephen are missing the literal keys to their homes, Seven Eccles and the Martello Tower, as well as the figurative keys of rule in their own usurped abodes. Both of them feel marginalized by their own countrymen. Similarly, Ireland herself is lacking in home rule, in contrast to its tiny neighbour, the Isle of Man. Here Joyce is setting up an analogy linking both Bloom's domestic dilemma and Stephen's living situation with Ireland's lack of autonomy, in contrast to the Isle of Man. It is, of course, as the episode goes on to elaborate, also the dilemma of the Jewish race. Ireland, the Jews, Bloom and Stephen are all in the same figurative space and condition of homeless usurpation. Nationalism and the struggle for Irish autonomy from English usurpation form very much the underlying fabric of the language in the newspaper office. For example, McHugh teases Miles Crawford about being the sham squire himself, a reference to the infamous turncoat informer, Francis Higgins, who in 1798 accepted a bribe for revealing Lord Edward Fitzgerald's whereabouts to Major Sirr. Then, under the headline, Memorable Battles Recalled, we find Crawford responding in irony. North Cork Militia, we won every time. The North Cork Militia, loyal to the Crown in the rebellion of 1798, enjoyed the dubious distinction of having disgraced itself in every action it was involved in. The section which follows is headlined, O Harp Aeolian, referring not only to McHugh's dental floss, but also to the national symbol of Ireland and slang term for Irish Catholic. A page later we find the newsboys in the hallway singing, We are the boys of Wexford, who fought with heart and hand. Lines from The Boys of Wexford, a ballad celebrating the total defeat in 1798 of the North Cork Militia by the Boys of Wexford. A few pages later, when Stephen and O'Madden Burke enter, they are asked, You look like communards, like fellows who had blown up the Bastille. Or was it you shot the Lord Lieutenant of Finland between you? You look as though you had done the deed, General Bobrikov. Stephen responds that, We were only thinking about it. The reference is a very topical one. Earlier that same morning, June 16th, 1904, Finnish insurrectionists had assassinated General Nikolay Ivanovich Bobrikov, the Russian Governor-General of Finland. The news had just reached Dublin, where the Irish could not help but see the parallel with their own attempts at colonial insurrection against a hated imperial power. The men in the newsroom then go on to discuss Ignatius Gallagher's reporting on the trial of the Invincibles for the Phoenix Park murders, the Irish version in 1882 of the assassination of the Russian general. Throughout the episode, Irish nationalism and colonial history are the threads woven into the very fabric of the language of Aeolus. When Crawford sings to McHugh 2 lines from The Rose of Castile, "'Twas rank and fame that tempted thee, 'twas empire charmed thy heart," The discussion in the room begins to focus around the issue of selling out to the temptations of the dominant powers of empire. Ironically, Crawford is himself about to tempt Stephen to sell out his artistic talents to the hegemonic institution of the press. In response, McHugh discusses the Imperium Romanum. We think of Rome, imperial, imperious, imperative. What was their civilization? Vast, I allow, but vile. Cloacae. Sewers. The Jews in the wilderness and on the mountaintop said, It is meet to be here. Let us build an altar to Jehovah. The Roman, like the Englishman who follows in his footsteps, brought to every new shore on which he set his foot only his cloacal obsession. He gazed about him in his toga, and he said, It is meet to be here. Let us construct a water closet. And Pontius Pilate is their prophet. In drawing a direct parallel between the Roman Empire ruling the Jews and killing Jesus and the British Empire ruling Ireland, McHugh is again suggesting a favourite Irish analogy between Irish servitude to England and the Israelites under an imperial yoke. McHugh's logic also follows the Celticist binarist urge to turn the tables and, in mirror fashion, simply relabel, within a static hierarchy of labels, the imperial aggressor as the primitive Philistine, obsessed only with water closets, and name oneself instead into the privileged position of arbiter in matters of the spirit. I teach the blatant Latin language. I speak the tongue of a race, the English, the acme of whose mentality is the maxim, time is money, material domination. Domine, Lord, where is the spirituality? A sofa in a West End club. He goes on, like Mulligan, to wax about the Greek as the radiance of the intellect. The closet maker and the cloaca maker will never be lords of our spirit. We are liege subjects of the Catholic chivalry of Europe that founded at Trafalgar, and of the empire of the spirit, not an imperium. But McHugh's eloquence is undercut by his implied admission of selling out and of servitude to the empire, a professor teaching the blatant Latin language of the supposedly barbaric imperia which he mocks, a server of a servant. Nationalism, servitude, and the lure of co-option by the empire now invoke John F. Taylor's famous speech at the College Historical Society, in which, as the story goes, Taylor dragged himself from his sickbed to speak in an extemporaneous response to Mr. Justice FitzGibbon's paper, advocating the revival of the Irish tongue. It was, in other words, a nationalist debate on the more purist positions in the Celticist agenda, focusing around Douglas Hyde's movement to de-Anglicize the Irish tongue. Once again, the favoured analogy is between the Jews, under Pharaoh, and the Irish. McHugh quotes Taylor's speech, imagining the words of the Egyptian high priest speaking to a youthful Moses. Why will you Jews not accept our culture, our religion, and our language? You are a tribe of nomad herdsmen. We are a mighty people. You have no cities nor no wealth. Our cities are hives of humanity, and our galleys, trireme and quadrireme, laden with all manner of merchandise, furrow the waters of the unknown globe. You have but emerged from primitive conditions. We have a literature, a priesthood, an age-long history, and a polity. The parallels are quite precise, since the Irish also differed from the English in culture, religion, and, at one time, language. Since Ireland was rural and poor, no cities nor no wealth. Since England was the sea's ruler, while under English servitude the Irish ports lay fallow and unused. And since, in their poverty, the Irish Catholics had been essentialized as primitives, without a culture of their own. You pray to a local and obscure idol. Our temples, majestic and mysterious, are the abodes of Isis and Osiris, and Horus and Ammon-Ra. Yours serfdom, awe and humbleness, ours thunder in the seas. Israel is weak, and few are her children. Egypt is an host, and terrible are her arms. Vagrants and day laborers are you called. The world trembles at our name. This is the dominant discourse of hegemonic power, tempting the subservient with the lure of joining the side of the conqueror. Taylor concludes the speech with his own stirring response to that lure. But, ladies and gentlemen, had the youthful Moses listened to and accepted that view of life, had he bowed his head and bowed his will and bowed his spirit before that arrogant admonition, he would never have brought the chosen people out of their house of bondage, nor followed the pillar of the cloud by day. He would never have spoken with the Eternal amid lightnings on Sinai's mountain-top, nor ever have come down with the light of inspiration shining in his countenance, and bearing in his arms the tables of the law, graven in the language of the outlaw. Taylor's speech is a piece of rhetoric which, unlike Dawson's, genuinely moves all the men in the room. It moved Joyce too, who knew it by heart and recorded, on phonodisc, this passage for posterity. Taylor's is an eloquent and persuasive argument about maintaining Irish cultural and national integrity and pride, as the Israelites had done under Moses, invoking, in the analogy, a solidarity of the oppressed and the enslaved. In this way, the Irish men can, like Joyce himself, appropriate the racialization, used against them by the British, of Irish racial otherness, by invoking a racialized analogy in a potentially positive, empowering, rather than debilitating manner, by using the model of the Israelites resisting Egyptian tyranny. But Joyce's very dramatic irony is clearly that, even so, these Irishmen can appropriate this notion of an Irish-Jewish analogy with conviction only insofar as it serves their own narrow purposes, which are those of an ethnocentric and nationalistic hierarchy mirroring that of their oppressors, a binary trap in which they wish simply to replace the English conquerors with themselves in the privileged position. For, even as they repeatedly invoke the Judaic-Irish analogy, they continue to mistreat and derogate the actual Jewish other in their midst, with the same old pejorative, ethnocentric, and xenophobic categories of racial impurity and absolute difference. Whereas the empowering analogy should allow the possibility of mutual learning from the experience of a shared servitude among different peoples, instead, the nationalist agenda erases that experience from the national consciousness, only to replace it with another masculist imperium that would again occlude or write out ethnic or cultural difference. The internal contradiction is trenchant, and so the John F. Taylor passage operates at various clashing levels of ideological and rhetorical power, meaning, and irony.